It was the evening of April 20, 1999, when I was landing in Rome after 3 flights, hours of layovers, a massive confusion at the train station. I managed to hail a cab to take me to my hotel. And as soon as the driver heard my accent, he started yelling at me. I had, of course, not heard the news about the shooting at the high school in Columbine, Colorado. The way my driver made it sound, steering the cab through heavy traffic in downtown Rome with one hand on the wheel while he looked over his shoulder and motioned at me with his other hand, I thought perhaps an army had invaded a high school and killed everyone there. In broken English sentences punctuated with frequent announcements in Italian that Americans are stupid, idiotas, he demanded some explanation for why Americans continue to allow this to happen. I kept trying to assure him that I was on his side of the issue, but you know how innocent can you really be if you live here? If you are a citizen here in a democracy that somehow allows it to go on, can any of us declare ourselves to be innocent because we happen to not agree? It may be hard for you to remember what the world was like 20 years ago, but there was no internet, there was no English TV in my hotel room, there were no internet cafes in the bad neighborhood of Rome where I was staying, so I was left to sit alone at the edge of a creaky old bed trying to watch the news in Italian and piece together the reports of the shooting that 2 students had killed 12 of their classmates and a teacher and wounded more than 20 other students before they took their own lives. I had a week in Italy to contemplate the tragedy, to compose the newspaper column in which I would colorfully express my own belief that my American peers really are idiotas, to which I received several hundred responses from readers of the news leader who suggested that I go back to Italy and not come home. But I was younger then and more naive. At that point, I had lost 3 church members to domestic violence. The count is now up to 5. And I felt like Columbine would finally unite Americans in a move towards sensible gun laws. But the next month, there was a hearing before the House Judiciary Committee in Washington, and it was none other than Darrell Scott, the father of 2 of the Columbine victims. His daughter had been killed, his son was seriously injured, but when he spoke to the Judiciary Committee, he lambasted the members who had been calling for gun reform. He insisted that the tragedy at Columbine was not the fault of lax gun laws, but it was the spiritual vacuum created in public schools by the banning of public prayer. Yeah, I don't know whether you could catch the groan on the video or not, but everybody here just groaned. I hope you did too. There were, of course, parents and surviving students who disagreed with him, but Scott got the TV cameras, and the wind went out of the sails of reform. In the 20 years since Columbine, there have been additions of metal detectors, armed guards, hardened entries to schools, but when it comes to the guns, it's still just thoughts and prayers. That's all we get from our government elected officials. I'm sure you can anticipate the unavoidable comparison to be made between our government and the government of New Zealand, which just 6 days after the shooting in 2 mosques in Christchurch has outlawed semi-automatic rifles, the large ammunition magazines or clips, the hardware necessary to alter a rifle to make it fire more rapidly, the bump stocks that have been used in several incidents here. They've outlawed all that already. How many mass murders does it take for the government to act to protect its citizens? In New Zealand, 1. We've had more than 50 highly publicized mass murders since Columbine. Too many to even read their names within the confines of a single sermon. but the victims have been in varied circumstances and the result of diverse causes. In 2007, there were 32 students killed at Virginia Tech. We held a midnight vigil here in this sanctuary in July of 2012 when a dozen people were murdered in a movie theater in Aurora, Colorado. Again, we dared to believe that things would finally change in 2012 when 27 children were killed at the Sandy Hook Elementary School in Connecticut. So many little kids, 6 and 7 years old. How could we not take action then? In July of 2015, we took up an offering to help the Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston to repair their historic church after the pastor and 8 other members were murdered in a racially motivated mass killing. I delivered the check in person. I drove it down there while the blood of the victims was still on the floor of the sanctuary. The next year, a lone gunman, confused about his own sexual identity, went into a gay nightclub in Orlando and killed a seemingly impossible 49 people. And there was an armed guard at the door. He was just the first one shot. But the very next year, even that staggering number of casualties was topped when 58 people were killed while attending an open-air concert in Las Vegas. The next month, 26 were killed on a Sunday morning in a little church in Sutherland Springs, Texas. It was a year ago today when most of the members of this church were gathered in a peaceful demonstration on our town square following the February shooting at the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, that left 17 dead. Student-led demonstrations were held in Washington, D.C., and all over the world that day. It was the largest demonstration in America since the Vietnam War, and still nothing has been done. It seems inescapable to conclude just what my taxi driver in Rome had concluded. Americans are idiotas. I mentioned last week that the shooter in New Zealand was not a native of New Zealand. He's an Australian, but he couldn't carry out his evil plan in Australia because their gun laws are too restrictive for him to have gotten his hands on the hardware he would need to commit the mass murder he planned. It deserves to be said that the reason gun laws are so strict in Australia is because there was a mass murder at Port Arthur in 1996 in which a lone gunman killed 35 people. In response to that single tragedy, again, how many mass murders does it take to change? One in Australia. The government not only outlawed the kind of weapon used, but they launched an aggressive buyback program and rounded up tens of thousands of similar weapons in the country, a move that was so unpopular in gun-loving Australia that most of the politicians who voted for it were voted out of office in the next election, but still the law stands. Now, did those politicians know that they would be voted out of office? The ones I've heard interviewed certainly did, but they did it because it was the right thing to do. They knew that they had been elected to serve the best interests of the people, and it was in the best interests of the people to get these weapons collected. They committed political suicide, but political suicide is so much to be preferred over mass murder. I suspect that New Zealand's Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, once the dew of her current media popularity passes and people have a very short memory, it will pass. She will probably suffer a similar fate at the ballot box, but my sense is that she won't care. It's still the right thing to do. I sort of hate to say this on camera since people all over the world learn about Missouri from our videos, but the same week that New Zealand outlawed assault rifles, our Republican-led Senate in our state proposed a bill similar to one that they've passed several times in the past, which restricts Missouri law officers from enforcing any federal gun laws, any that existed in the past or any that will exist in the future. No matter what the Congress says, the state of Missouri has told their law enforcement agents that they are not to enforce any federal gun laws. I don't think that's constitutional. I don't think they can actually do that. But our legislature does these sorts of things to keep Kentucky and Arkansas and Kansas and Oklahoma from feeling stupid. Yay, Missouri. There are reasons for America's resistance to change. Our political system has become very cash dependent, so political donations of special interest can easily outweigh the wishes of voters. There is a history of a gun culture in America that is rooted in the fact that we took this continent and built our infrastructure by killing millions of Native Americans, enslaving millions of Africans, and militarily taking the northern half of the nation of Mexico at gunpoint. My ancestors were gun owners because they had to have guns to steal land from Indians and to keep their slaves on the plantation, to do the work that they were too lazy to do. If you ever think about reparations, it's kind of like, yeah, you didn't want to go clear those fields and harvest those crops. It's time for you to pay your interns their salaries. And for the past few generations, the unresolved crimes of murder and slavery have kept Americans as enthusiastic gun owners out of sheer fear. My father bought a lot of guns in the 1960s because he was anticipating a race war during the Civil Rights Movement. The same thing that made some of our founders buy guns to keep their slaves on the plantation. In the 1960s and 70s, white people were buying guns in order to protect themselves from the sons and daughters of slaves who might eventually look for revenge. Our story has corollaries in New Zealand, Australia, Canada. There have been seasons of national madness in Japan and Germany and in other places. Currently, there's a lot of gun violence in Mexico because of a drug civil war, in Venezuela because of the breakdown of their government, in South Africa because of after apartheid, things get dicey. But all of that has similarities to what's happened in the United States. The problem we have to consider is that though fascist sentiments remain in Germany and there's still racism in Japan, they saw what these sentiments led their nation to do, and they have enacted laws to make certain that they will never go down that road again. Australia saw what their gun culture led to, and so they changed their laws. New Zealand got just a taste of the insanity that can be imported into their country in an afternoon, and in 6 days, they changed their laws. I think we have to accept that my dangerously distracted taxi driver in Rome was fundamentally right. We can't keep blaming the NRA or the GOP or the gun lobby when ultimately in a democracy, responsibility falls to all of us. What, after all, is the combined force of the NRA and the GOP compared with the silence of over 400,000 churches in America? In conclusion, I have 2 points. The first is that I want to take back our democracy. And the other is I want to take back our churches. Amen. The difference between an oligarchy and a democracy is that in an oligarchy, the country is managed by a few special interests. 8 is implied in the name oligarchy, but a few corporations and special interests that have more power than the collective votes of the population. In a democracy, ostensibly, the ballot box is the ultimate authority. Most serious political analysts tell us that we have already, in America, evolved away from a democracy and that we have become an oligarchy. Large corporations and special interests are in charge. Last year, after the Parkland massacre, the NPR polled Americans, and found that 75% of Americans are in favor of sensible gun control legislation being enacted. 75% of voters. And that was 92% of Democrats, but it was still 59% of Republicans and 68% of independents. The overwhelming majority of people in this country want sensible gun laws. If we had a democracy, then we would have sensible gun laws. But the oligarchy that runs our government is unimpressed by the 30,000 gun deaths we have every year, and they are choosing their own profits over the lives of Americans and over the will of America. Even if you get into such a specific group as gun owners and the people who are members of the NRA, 72% of NRA members are in favor of things like background checks before a gun can be purchased. Men and women, America has got to get our democracy back so that our votes matter and so that a majority opinion about something as important as this can become law. New Zealand got it done in 6 days. Australia got it done in 12 days. We've been awash in senseless murders for decades, but we are not really a nation of idiotas. We can do this. We are empowered to do this. Now, if I may be indulged a moment of personal privilege, and I can't imagine a one of you would stop me. I've been preaching about and writing newspaper articles in favor of gun control for more than 30 years. An awful lot of people, both within the church and in my reading public, have told me emphatically that I have no business talking about political issues, either in print or in the pulpit. And I want to drill down on that point for just a minute. What is a political issue and what is an issue of morality? Since obviously morality is the purview of the church. That's what we exist to talk about. So what's the difference between a political issue and a moral issue? And I've been at this for a long time, so I can tell you, I know what the difference is. When someone disagrees with me, it's political. And when they agree, I'm being a prophetic preacher. It's not any more complicated than that. There are websites that will, this afternoon, carry the video of this message that have previously rejected my sermons and columns about gun control. Now, why have they changed? Why are they going to represent this one? The only reason is because the topic has become popular among their constituency. It was politics when they didn't want me to alienate their members and donors. Now it's fair game because it will attract members and donors. So as to my second point, taking back the churches, I would like to ask my sisters and brothers who are still in the Christian ministry, do you think they nailed Jesus to the cross for being a moderate? Do you believe that Jesus always looked for the middle way? Do you think that Jesus shied away from controversial topics because some of his wealthy donors might be offended? Aren't you the people who have asked the rest of us to question ourselves, asking, what would Jesus do? Churches that remain silent on difficult ethical issues out of fear of losing church members and donors, I get it. I have regularly run off major donors, and it does affect the bottom line. It affects how easily you can manage your church budget, and sorry, guys, it affects our salaries, but, you know, it's who we are. But when I look in the mirror in the morning and I hold a razor in my hand and I have to make the decision about whether I'm going to cut my throat or shave, it doesn't take me very long to decide because I know what I'm going to do after I get dressed. When you are afraid to speak up on a matter that is costing 30,000 lives every year in America because some gun nut in your congregation won't agree with you, let me just tell you, you should stay away from sharp objects because if your conscience ever wakes up, you will represent a clear and present danger to yourself. Martin Luther King used to say that our country needs our churches to be its headlights, not its taillights. But in matters of social change on almost every difficult topic, think back, gay rights, women's rights, civil rights, the church has been in the caboose, always hiding until the topic became popularly approved. We have almost never been in the locomotive. A church that cannot come out strongly in favor of sensible gun laws should consider closing and allowing their building to be used for public housing or a flea market or something as useful as a parking lot. Men and women, the middle of the road is for yellow stripes and dead armadillos, not churches. That is, of course, my opinion. Just so happens that I'm right.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.